Thank you, Luan, and I would like to say it's also been my pleasure and a great honour to be appointed as this year's Dodson Visiting Professor and to be talking to you today. It's been a real privilege to work with students, faculty, and to meet many professionals in the area and share thoughts and views. So, the title of my talk is based on the outcomes of my largest and longest research project to date. And today I'd like to share with you the key stages of the research journey, which in fact is still continuing. So my aim is straightforward today. I'd like to try and inform you and inspire you. And I hope that that will lead you to inquire whether on the topic that I'm talking about today or on something else that sparked from it, perhaps research methodology. Interestingly, this research was inspired by a Canadian. And when I wrote the bid to fund it, I could not, or at least I did not, prophesy that a decade later I would be in Canada speaking about it. And in fact, I'll mention not one, but 3 Canadians during my talk. So, let me begin. What I'd like to do is very briefly set the context and then discuss the research project in question that Luan mentioned, ASIM, Accelerating Positive Change in Records Management, the key findings and some of the impact it's had. And that will lead on to my proposition that managing records in the digital environment is a wicked problem, and how the Cynefin framework provided a different lens for making sense of the data that we'd collected and taking appropriate action. And I'll end with some thoughts on the future. So, to begin, the context. Today's digital world is very different from the analog world of the past. It's connected, it's complicated, it's in constant change, it's decentralized, it's non-custodial, and it's uncontrolled, or perhaps less or partly controlled. It's fundamentally changing the way in which we harvest and use information, breaking down barriers, radically reconfiguring the relationships between creators, providers and consumers. It's transforming delivery of learning, services and processes. And it's fueling societal expectations and fears of a technology-enabled surveillance society. The digital paradigm is the challenge for the information sciences in general and in particular for records management. And it presents us with some significant and non-trivial challenges. For example, the nature of digital information, the volume of digital information, and the ever-present human dimension. So let me say a few words briefly about each of these. First, on the nature of information. Not only do we have different forms and formats, but the composition of digital information is different. We've moved from the fixed and tangible to the fragmented and virtual. Assets without a fixed existence, in a sense. In the cloud, created using mobile devices, etc. As the popular culture writer Andrew Keane said, the record, not the remix, is the anomaly today. The remix is the very nature of the digital. However, when the fragments are connected through metadata and interoperable systems, then our digital information and records are liquid information assets, because they're identified, retrievable, and accessible. They're authentic, reliable, and understood. They're usable, valued, and valuable. So what about the volume? This is a second challenge, the sheer volume of digital information being created and captured. This personal digital footprint calculator enables you to estimate and track the amount of digital information you create, your digital footprint. It's fairly crude, but it gives an indication. My footprint last week was according to the answers I gave to the questions, estimated at just over 6 megabytes per day. Questions included how many emails you sent, how many downloads, how many recipients of emails, how many attachments, how many videos you stored or downloaded, how many photographs you stored. I reckon if I've got my maths right, that's 2 gigabytes a year. That is not true, so I think it's crude. However, it's an indication and you can set it to track. So in this world of huge volumes, what will we retain when space isn't the issue, but value, access, use, and sustainability are? Alongside appraisal, a fundamental records management theoretical principle, technology-assisted analysis, such as data analytics, is increasingly important. Without more sophisticated ways of finding patterns and analysing meaning, how will we understand the digital tsunami of information to support decision-making and the more efficient and effective operation of business today? Let alone make sense of the digital iceberg for tomorrow's history. Even if we retain only a fraction of what we're currently creating, it's still orders of magnitude more than anything we've witnessed in the past. Over a decade ago, in our second Records Management Witness Seminar on the challenges of managing email, we debated the keep everything issue. Just because we can, should we? Or should we think of delete as the virtue of forgetting in the digital age, as Victor Mayer-Schönberger suggests in his eponymously titled book, where he argues that in our quest for perfect digital memories, where we can store everything from recipes and family photographs to work emails and personal information, we've put ourselves in danger of losing a very human quality, the ability and privilege of forgetting. And that takes me to the human dimension. My third example of significant challenges, and certainly not the least. It presents issues of privacy, openness, sharing, and trust. The latter being the focus of the latest Inter Pares research project, iTrust, led by Dr. Duranty, my first Canadian connection. In the digital world, far more information and records consumers are also information and records creators. They have rights, and they're often acutely aware of those rights, particularly in relation to privacy and access. Witness last year's landmark ruling by a Spanish citizen against Google and a Spanish newspaper, which has already contested a proposal by the EU Parliament about including the right to be forgotten in the new data protection regulations due next year, I think. Rights are always accompanied by responsibilities. The responsibility to use, share appropriately, and to manage. Yet every week, the media publishes examples of failures in one or more of these. Only 2 weeks ago, the imbroglio of Hillary Clinton's use of personal email account and file servers was exposed while she was doing government business. And commentary on the rights and wrongs continues. Perhaps AT&T's patents on, and I quote, a method, system, and apparatus for providing self-destructing electronic mail messages, unquote, will provide a solution to safeguarding sensitive data in an email context. Having looked at the patent, I think it requires human intervention. So, not a total automatic solution. From the research I've done and the very nature of human beings, I believe the people dimension is the greatest challenge in the digital information world. As McDonald, my second Canadian connection, said 20 years ago, the autonomy of the individual reigns supreme. That was well before the development and widespread adoption of social media tools and apps, which only serve to continue the individual's supremacy. Their information behaviour and literacy, preferences and cultures, challenges. With autonomy comes responsibility. However, not all users recognise their responsibilities, and even if they do, they may not have the necessary knowledge and skills to exercise them. Their information discernment and ability to manage their information in a fit-for-purpose manner may not be adequate, yet they are potentially the long-term custodians of records. These are but 3 of the challenges we face in managing records in this digital environment. "20 years ago, John McDonald, when he was working for the National Archives of Canada, wrote an article entitled "Managing Records in the Modern Office, Taming the Wild Frontier," in which he discussed the rapid evolution in the level of sophistication of the software tools commonplace on the desktop, yet relatively slow evolution in their application to organizations' business processes. He shared a vision that I hadn't heard or seen expressed anywhere before. And I read that soon after the publication, so it wasn't a long time after. And he said, as it shows on the screen, "Right now my screen is full of icons that represent a toolbox of software utilities, such as word processing, spreadsheet, email, database, etc. In the future, as a program manager, I want a screen that contains icons that reflect the business activities that I manage. In my work environment at the National Archives, I want the icons to be based on the operational plan framework of the program, of the department. He continued, "When I click on the routing list for my proposal, rather than having to select from all the names of the staff at the National Archives, I want to see the names of those people who normally receive development project proposals. I also want to know, if as the proposal is being sent, that the record-keeping rules that were designed into the project development application are respected." He wanted icons that supported his work activities and processes. His vision revolved around business applications rather than software utilities. He wanted to move from this to this. But is it really a reality yet? Not in an organisational context for most of us. I think it's more so in a social context with the advent of apps. I was fortunate enough to meet John McDonald at the 2002 RMS annual conference, and I later invited him to write a chapter in a book that I co-edited on managing electronic records. As it was a decade after his Wild Frontier article, I asked him to reflect on the Wild Frontier a decade later, and he concluded, "The frontier of the modern office is still wild." Seminal examples of academic research are Bierman and Cox on the requirements for managing electronic records, Durante on the integrity of electronic records and methods for ensuring their maintenance, or the maintenance of authentic and reliable records over time in electronic systems, and the continuum model work of McLean, Upward, and McKemish and colleagues. Much of this began by building theoretical or conceptual constructs, which were followed by testing and/or practical application projects. Nonetheless, the management of electronic records continued to be a challenge for organisations. McLeod felt the pace of change had been relatively slow because of poor understanding of how today's office functions and how it could benefit from advanced tools for managing work processes and their associated records, and what it means to design and implement relevant infrastructures for managing records. But 10 years on in this chapter, he proposed some ways out of the wilderness. And they're here on the slide. Establishing a vision, enhancing awareness of all those involved in record keeping, assigning accountability, designing an architecture, and actually building capacity to manage records. And this was the inspiration for my research, and a bid for funding to the AHRC, which is similar to AHRC in Canada, to investigate and critically explore issues and practical strategies to support accelerating the pace of positive change in ERM. It wouldn't be possible to address all of the issues that John suggested as ways out of the wilderness in a single project. So we decided to concentrate on what he described as designing an architecture. The components of a records management infrastructure, i.e. policies, standards, systems, technologies, and human resources. ASERM was very much about linking multidisciplinary principles and practice, searching for the evidence base on a more strategic and wider scale than we believed had been done before. The aim was to investigate and critically explore issues and practical strategies to support accelerating the pace of positive change in managing electronic records. It was a strategic project, not in search of a single solution or developing a specific system, but gathering knowledge of practical strategies and critical success factors and multidisciplinary opinion on ERM issues and potential solutions. We hoped to develop an appropriate paradigm for ERM. On reflection, that was quite a big ask. So, the research design. The project was a qualitative study, and it comprised 3 phases. A comprehensive systematic literature review, which identified over 1,500 items selected from particular databases, evaluated them against a set of a priori criteria, and provided outputs on selected topics such as case examples, critical success factors, and we actually also made selected grey literature available via a custom Google search engine for people to search. The rationale for the SLR approach was that it selects the relevant, good quality work from the huge amount of information that's available. Using an efficient technique, it enables generalizability of findings, it explains any inconsistencies and conflicts, and it achieves greater accuracy. It was the first time that SLR methodology had been used in the records management field, to my knowledge. Of the 1,500 plus items that we found, 44% were selected and the remainder rejected. And the 2 main reasons for rejection were lightweight or cursory treatment or irrelevancy, so false drops in effect. The second phase was an investigation, and it investigated 3 facets, the 3 that are there, for designing an architecture for ERM. The people issues, understanding work processes, and although I've put technology there, it was systems and technologies. The 3 facets of designing an architecture that John MacDonald had identified. The investigation comprised a series of e-Delphi studies with a full range of stakeholders involved in managing records. So not just records managers, but managers, records creators, information technology people. The people who, the 4 stakeholder groups that the ISO standard identifies. Each of the Delphi studies was followed by a colloquium or a seminar at which we discussed and tried to extend and or validate the findings and develop outputs which we labelled as vignettes. And those were for use in practice and or in academia by different players. Over 200 people across the world from multiple disciplines and, as I say, spanning all the stakeholder groups took part, either face-to-face at one of the colloquia or in an electronic virtual sense with one of the Delphi studies. We used the findings from the SLR to inform the investigation stage and the Delphi studies. So we use them to develop our questions. And when we gathered the Delphi questionnaires electronically through email, we analysed them in two main ways. We used a thematic analysis, where we identified the themes that emerged from the individual responses to questions. And for some of the emergent issues, we experimented using phenomenological analysis to explore the topic or the phenomenon subjectively under a number of standard headings. Essentially, that allowed us to add the benefits, the insights, and our own synoptic view of the individual responses into the mix. The third phase, and it wasn't the last one, because as you can see from the diagram, it took place throughout the life of the project, was a major dissemination activity. We used a website, blog, and Twitter when it came on the scene to release and/or publicise interim findings, and also to try and collect data and views. At the time, this was a novel approach in the UK, and certainly in the case of a UK Research Council-funded project in our field. Typically, projects like that are characterised by publishing articles at the very end in academic journals, so after the research is over. But the very nature of the topic made us hope that the AHRC, and thankfully they did, or the reviewers there, recognised that actually that wasn't a sensible publication and dissemination strategy for our project. I realised that that novelty is no longer there, and I'm very impressed with, for instance, the work that the Inter Pares team do in disseminating what they're doing and where they've got to as they go along. But at the time, it was novel. So just to summarise the Delphi studies, there were 3 sets for each of the facets. There's 3 facets. And for 2 of them, there were 5 rounds. And for the technology facet, we only needed 4 in the end. We didn't need a 5th one. So what we tried to do was identify and explore issues related to people or related to processes by asking questions. We clarified those, explored them, and then we asked our Delphi participants to rank them as according to either how important or how urgent they were to address. And having done that, we selected them in their ranked order and asked them, we proposed some solutions, and asked them to propose solutions. And interestingly, we asked them to propose solutions either to try or to avoid. And that was based on either experience or what they thought would work or not work. And we tried to evaluate those. So we rated them, or we asked some questions, different questions depending on where we were, whether it was the process or people facet or whether it was the technology facet. But they were around feasibility, desirability, and those kinds of things. We produced a series of what we called vignettes as we went along. Some of them were representations of the findings. So this was from the first people Delphi, and it represented the 8 main issues that arose and tried to capture in a, I'd not really call it a rich picture, it's more a cross between that and a mind map, I suppose, but in a visual sense, what we'd found from lots of detailed data. The solutions, these are, we produced Wordles, and in fact, that was fairly new, that software, when we used it. These are the solutions to try. Notice how many people issues there are there, not surprisingly. Records professionals appear quite large on there. But these are the people issues to avoid. And look what happens to pop up there too. Records professionals. And I'll come back to that a little bit later. Another type of output was a story based on reading the data, reading the responses, and knowledge from the literature. And I am aware that that story has been used and revised slightly in a training scenario with an international organisation. All of these are available on the website. We even tried fridge phrases, so magnetic strips with all of the words that we'd picked up from the analysis from the data, and tried in one of the colloquia to get people to actually use them to put together either a vision or a strategy for moving forward. We were experimenting with different things that might help. And this was perhaps, this is the one that I wish really had worked. In our first colloquium, one of the table of participants, this is a digital photo of a flip chart of a snakes and ladders game. So they produced it, I can take no credit, and they had various things for going up or going down, the snakes and the ladders. And I actually spoke with colleagues at Northumbria to try and turn that into a game, because we have game theory people in computing. But the problem is, snakes and ladders is really just on the luck of the dice. So it doesn't really work, and you need a good, solid theory behind your game to make it work, which was sad, because it would have been good, I think. It would have been fun to get people to think about the issues. Okay, but from all of that data, what did we find in terms of some headline findings? 10 headline findings emerged, and they are these: that few organisations or individuals have articulated a vision for ERM, and remember that was something that John MacDonald thought was lacking. The people, process and systems / technology aspects of ERM are inextricably linked. So in other words, our three facets that we tried to explore were not isolated. They were just so intertwined. People issues are fundamental and challenging. They came up in all three facets, whether we were talking about processes or technology, as well as people. A wide range of critical success factors existed for ERM projects, applicable to all or many organisations, because they came from different kinds of organisations, and they were in the literature too. And tactics and solutions for ERM were contextualised and complex. Moving on, sixth one, success and or failure of ERM implementations can be contingent on the presence or absence of small or accidental factors. Examples that I can recall are things like a particular CEO being there or not being there, making the difference. Interestingly, we found few published in-depth critical case studies. There were lots of case examples, but they weren't necessarily in-depth or critical in their approach, whether that was of success, but particularly of failure. No one wants to publish about a failure, and yet failures are often where we learn the most lessons, personally. Speaking for myself, I should say. Or indeed, case studies of post-implementation evaluation. There were implementations, but not necessarily evaluation. Proportionate and risk-based approaches are needed, so not perfection. And there was a lot of debate in the data about records management principles, whether they were applicable for ERM, and the general sense at the time was they are, but that practice needed to be adapted. And then that last one that was writ large in those two wordles earlier. Records professionals may be part of the problem as well as part of the solution. So I'm a problem as well as hopefully a solution. So, moving on. The headlines represented a high-level view of a very rich and nuanced data set. The different vignettes and other presentations of the analysis were often detailed and granular, and or they used research terminology, and anecdotal evidence in comments from users indicated they were unsure about how to apply the findings in their own context. So we needed a different way of interpreting or analysing the data and presenting it in ways it would be possible to use the findings more readily, whether that was in practice or in practice being professional practice or in academic practice. So how to make sense of the findings? Well, I take some comfort in Dr. Lawrence Peters' observation and his almanac entry that some problems are so complex that you have to be highly intelligent and well-informed just to be undecided about them. And since I'm a Libran and undecided about lots of things, then I take a lot of comfort in that. And actually, I took great pleasure in borrowing the book to see the pages on print from the library here in this building. It took less than 20 minutes to get it from the store, so I was incredibly impressed. And what I was further impressed about, and I hadn't realised, this guy is better known for a principle we probably know far better, the Peter principle, his succinct theory of failure. In a hierarchy, every employee tends to rise to his or her, I should say, in a politically correct environment now, his or her level of incompetence. But what I didn't know was Peter was actually born in Vancouver. So he is my third and final Canadian connection. So is this the problem we're faced with? Is it because managing records in the digital environment is a wicked problem? In their 1973 seminal paper, Dilemmas in a General Theory of Planning, Rittel and Weber articulated the concept of a wicked problem as having 10 characteristics. First of all, wicked problems lack a definitive formulation. A series of things about the solutions. There's no criteria for knowing when the or a solution has been found. And solutions are not true or false, but they're rather good or bad. There's no immediate or ultimate test of a solution. Every solution counts and has significant consequences. And there are no criteria for proving that all solutions have been identified and considered. Some more characteristics about the problem. A wicked problem is essentially a unique problem, and it's often seen as a symptom of another problem. There's no criteria for determining the correct explanation of the problem. The problem is the problem. And leaders and managers have no right to be wrong with wicked problems. There's a lot of detail about this, which I don't have time to go into today, but they contrasted wicked problems with tame problems. Tame problems being well-defined, belonging to groups of similar problems that can be solved in similar ways. So if you have a tame problem, you solve it one way. Another similar tame problem can be solved in a similar way. And where there are a limited number of alternative solutions that can be evaluated. In the digital world, it seemed that records management exhibits the characteristics of a wicked problem. So a colleague and I proposed that notion in 2 articles that we published in 2013. And we defended our proposal by identifying examples of the 10 characteristics, grouping interrelated ones together. So, for instance, formulation of the problem is the problem, as it's determined by context, perspectives, and system or service requirements. And these will differ depending on the stakeholder, whether it's the CEO, the legal counsel, the creator or the user, or the records manager. Different contexts, cultures, histories, and contingencies at a given point make an organisation's digital records problem unique, the wickedness reflecting the range of perspectives among the problem's stakeholders. And there were other examples. Conklin suggests that wicked problems demand tools and methods which create shared understanding and shared commitment. He talks about dialogue mapping as a tool for doing that. Understanding a wicked problem is about collectively making sense of the situation and coming to shared understanding about who wants what. Because the group or team's understanding of the wicked problem is evolving, productive movement toward a solution requires powerful mechanisms for getting everyone on the same page. There'll be volumes of facts, there'll be data, studies, reports about a wicked problem, but it's the shared commitment that's needed to create a durable solution. So we believed we had a wicked problem. We had 10 headline findings and we had a lot of nuanced data about the issues and solutions. And we felt we really hadn't an adequate sense of all of that. And sense that would make it usable, our research usable to others. The complexity made producing a conceptual framework of the findings very challenging. But one of my PhD students' discovery of the Cynefin framework inspired me to consider its applicability for our project. It seems to provide an appropriate or a possible approach to dealing with the nature of ERM and the quantity of disparate solutions that we'd found. So what of the Cynefin framework? It's a Welsh word meaning habitat or place, chosen by Dr. David Snowden, who developed it with colleagues when he was at IBM. And it's a perspective on the evolutionary nature of complex systems. He developed the framework from his and colleagues' action research into the use of narrative and complexity theory in organizational knowledge exchange, decision-making, strategy, and policy-making, as a sense-making device to help people deal with complexity. So it rang very much true with the kinds of things we were working with. A framework that helps decision-makers to make sense of a range of business problems and situations in dynamic contexts. The frameworks are used with groups of people in organizations and as a technique to help them through discussion and storytelling to identify problems, understand the situations, and become aware of different perspectives and decide on appropriate solutions. The framework comprises 4+1 domains: the simple, the complicated, the complex, and the chaotic. And the +1 is the black hole in the middle, disorder. Simple is about direct cause and effect. If X happens, then it causes Y. It's repeatable, perceivable, and predictable. So for problems or issues that occur in that domain, you identify, i.e. you sense the problem or the issue, you categorize it, and then you apply some predetermined practice. So because the situation is stable and repeatable, then you develop best practice or adopt best practice. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's very quick, just because it's in the simple domain. It might take a lot of effort, knowledge, and expertise, but there is best practice to help. It is about the known knowns. The complicated is also about cause and effect, but they're separated over time, and so need analysis to be understood. So there's not a single clear answer, no one right answer. You require fact-finding, research undertaken by experts, and you need to interpret the findings. But of course, experts can give different opinions, so you have to select between those opinions. Hence, this is about good practice, not necessarily best practice. And then we come to the complex, where cause and effect are only coherent with hindsight, in retrospect. So this is all about probing, sensing what happened, looking for patterns before deciding how to respond. It's the domain of messy people issues. So the complicated is about known knowns, and the complex about knowable unknowns. And chaos. No cause and effect relationship is perceivable. And therefore the important thing is to act quickly and decisively to try and reduce the chaos. Sense the reaction to that intervention, then respond, and it might have a positive strengthening effect or a negative one. It's the domain of novel practice, and it's the domain of the unknowable unknowns. I sort of feel a bit like the US Secretary of State, Donald Rumsfeld, in saying all that, which is why I didn't say them all together, actually. And disorder, well, that's where there are varying views on the state of causality. So action is really based on personal preferences and maybe comfort zone. So where could ERM reside in the framework? Is it in the known or the knowable domains, the ones on the right-hand side? Perhaps, but we thought it was complex, so is it somewhere on the left? Now, there are other elements to this framework. I have very much taken a high level and a simple approach to it because of the time. Two important elements are the connections between central management and others, which are represented as tetrahedrons in Snowden's diagrams, and the dynamics, the movement between these domains across the border to change a situation. So it's more complex. So very quickly, we mapped the people issues. We just took the people issues and we mapped them onto this diagram. There were over 400 of them, very nuanced themes. Interestingly, over half of them were in the simple or complicated domain and about a third in the complex domain. And we did have a few in chaos, and we actually put one in the black hole in the middle because we didn't quite know where it fitted, and that was vendors sell silver bullets. So maybe it's not the right place, but we didn't fit it anywhere else. So I give you just a little bit of a sense of what we actually got from this. On the left-hand side, the domains. In the middle are meta-themes, the issues. And on the right-hand side, some examples. And this literally is just a selection of examples of applicable solutions. I haven't got the full detail there because it doesn't translate well to a slide. But when you were in the sense of looking at this data, and when we pulled it out, it became very clear the nuances and the differences between issues that might, or initially to us, seemed quite similar, but were nuanced and different and fell in different domains, perhaps the simple versus the complex. So the Cynefin framework helped us to decouple issues that I think we'd conflated during our analysis. Now, as researchers, we should avoid bias and best guessing, but it's natural to wonder. And we thought, well, I shall say I thought, I won't speak for my colleague, that we might find mostly complex and issues in the complex domain or in the chaos domain. But as you saw earlier on, there were quite a lot of issues in the simple and complicated domain. But it revealed the truly complex ones. It enabled us to do some more in-depth thinking about those issues, and it identified nuances between individual issues within families of issues, those meta-themes, so to speak. And it helped us, as that last table showed, to try and target issues to solutions, which we'd really failed to do up to that point in the analysis. So reconceptualizing ERM through a different lens. What's it done for us? Well, if we think about the wicked problem lens first, immediately we view managing records in the digital world as a wicked problem. We reject the idea that we can precisely formulate and explain it, or indeed know when we found a solution. Only that the solution we found has consequences, for instance, with all the EDRMS implementations and SharePoint. One might say that we already know this. Indeed we do, but this lens is somehow liberating. It explains why there's no silver bullet and why keep trying to find a single solution for a problem of inherent diversity and complexity, as one of our participants said, is inappropriate. It also implies that perfection is neither attainable nor necessary. The latter suggests we need to take a proportionate approach, a risk-based approach, or as Barbara Breed put it when she recently called on professionals to embrace the principle of rethinking archival methods, a more pragmatic approach, devising strategies to capture and manage key evidence of business. Perfection is rarely necessary. As for Cynefin, it provides a different lens through which to view and make sense of ERM, and it shows it's not an intractable problem. Aspects of it are tame and can be managed. However, understanding the nature of the many issues that comprise the challenge is vital to selecting the appropriate approaches to tackling them. It led to a conceptual and strategic mapping of the issues and a clearer, more coherent, contextualized framework for ERM that supports both a holistic approach to understanding the issues and a granular approach. We tried it in one of the articles on certain topics. And it enabled us to present the findings in a way that supports a more strategic decision-making approach to ERM. So to wrap up, the future. We know that the research has had an impact, for example, at the United Nations and in parts of academia, on influencing information behaviour, an economic impact in the case of one organisation. And we know it strongly influenced the publication of a book last year, one of whom, a fourth Canadian connection, my apologies, one of whom, the author of which is Fiorella Foscarini, who graduated from UBC. But it left us with some questions, which is what all good research does. And these are just three of them. Can the conceptualization or reconceptualization of digital records management as a wicked problem help practice? Discussion with other academics and practitioners is required to really answer that. I know some who like the concept. How feasible is it to adopt the Cynefin framework in practice as a new lens for tackling the problem? That needs case studies, adoption in practice. And are the solutions to avoid that we found in the data innately inappropriate because they aren't in the right domain for the particular issue? Or were they unsuccessful just because of the contingency of success that I mentioned earlier? And that needs further analysis. So my very last slide. As Leonardo da Vinci wrote, knowing is not enough, we must apply. Being willing is not enough, we must do. And those questions mean that there is more that we need to do. But when faced with choices and new situations, as one of our project participants said, it's hard to be sure you're doing the right thing. We cannot be sure we're doing the right things, in my view. Only the best thing at the time, with the knowledge and the resources available, and that includes our research and this research. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was very interesting to me. I'm going to open it up for questions. We have time for a couple questions at least, I think. And I have a mic here, and I want to jump in.
Thank you, Julie.
Thank you.
So with your final questions regarding the futures, have you also considered, taking the approach with a grain of salt and, for example, considering questions related to whether adopting this interpretation of electronic records management as wicked problems could impact negatively on practice instead of positively, which is what you imply, right? So more like approaching the falsification approach of your thesis. And I think that could be helpful. There's one thing that I problematize when I see those interpretations of wicked problems and the Cynefin categorization.
Cynefin, yeah.
And is the essentialization of problem as an independent entity with its own ontology, separated from, for example, a knower someone for whom the problem is wicked.
Yeah.
Something that could be wicked for someone could be a tame one for a different person.
Yeah.
But I don't see that problematization there. It tends to separate those categories. So I think taking that grain of salt and introducing that falsification approach would be.
That's a really good idea. I mean, we didn't think, I wasn't aware of wicked problems as a concept when we started out with the project. And I've reflected on it since and thought, if we had known that, would we have used that as a framework for exploring the issues? We used John McDonald's framework. But I take your point, in the same way that we looked for solutions that work and those that don't work, I think looking at it as a wicked problem, whether that helps or not, could be useful. I think, to me, the 10 characteristics, as with the Cynefin framework, are ways of gathering multiple disciplines, not just records managers and archivists talking to each other. And that happens in the Inter Pares project. Multiple disciplines together, because you're absolutely right. What I might find is a wicked problem could be a tame one for someone else. If it's a technology issue, it may be very tame to an IT person, but it might actually be quite wicked to the records manager or the user. So I think that's a really good idea. And we haven't thought about taking that bit forward. We're finishing yet more things at the moment. But I'd be interested to talk more to you about it. I think it's a really good comment.
Well, I can ask one. I was really fascinated with the range of outputs that you came up with, ways to communicate your research results. So really impressed by that. And I guess I'll ask the kind of the opposite question. Have you and will you come back around to academic publishing on this? I mean, is that part of the plan? And in particular, do you think that what you found from the Cynefin framework can contribute something back to that framework and the development of it?
That's interesting. I don't think we've looked at the Cynefin framework in the sense of would we want to alter it based on what we've done, because we've used it to analyse data rather than to solve problems. We have written up, and I didn't put a list of those things up. There are 2 articles that I did refer to in 2013, the sort of part 1, the strategic thinking, and the part 2 where we took 4 particular examples, one of which was hypothetical, but in the sense of a real challenge that's facing us now, which is managing research data. And we wondered if that might help solve that problem or take a project approach to that. So we have published. We've also published an article in Library and Information Science Research about whether or not the Cynefin framework is more widely usable for analysing very nuanced qualitative data. So not just in our field. And as I say, with the Cynefin framework, I think I wouldn't feel comfortable in suggesting changes or adaptations or slight revisions without at least some real case studies to see if it works. Because I'm well aware that Dave Snowden and others have used it for many years in real situations. And I know that if you just follow the way it's developed, it has subtly developed over time. But I can certainly make those references available. And it would be interesting to see if anyone was keen to look at how to use it for analysing nuanced, rich, qualitative data, which you could argue all qualitative data is, as we were discussing last week. Yes, all good qualitative data. Yes, sorry, I should preface that. Yeah.
Good. Anyone else? Okay, well, I'm going to thank you again for an excellent talk. Thanks, Julie.
Thank you.